That never before have all 5 nominees for the Best Supporting Actor been nominated for the very first time.
And those gentlemen are...
Richard Jaeckel in Sometimes a Great Notion.
Behind more than 150 screen credits, an Academy Award nomination, and a 5-decade Hollywood career built on war films, westerns, and working-class grit, there was no straight climb to stardom, but a slow, relentless narrowing of space between fame and obscurity. Indeed, the tragedy of Richard Jaeckel is even sadder than we thought. He was a dependable on-screen soldier beside names like John Wayne, Gregory Peck, and Paul Newman. His life tracked the rise of American cinema itself. Yet, his story ended in tragedy. A chance discovery in wartime Hollywood. It's the early 1940s. Los Angeles sits far from the theater of war, but the heat wave has scorched every nook and cranny of the city nonetheless. A boy moves through the streets with a stack of envelopes pressed against his chest, cutting through studio corridors that smell faintly of ink, dust, and hot stage lights bleeding through closed doors. Outside, the city is under blackout orders at night and wrapped in the strange calm of a country at war. Air raid sirens are tested in the distance, ration lines form quietly at grocery stores, and men in uniform are a common sight on street corners. Inside 20th Century Fox, however, the war is being processed differently. Not in trenches or ships, but in scripts, casting calls, and sound stages that simulate battlefields under controlled lighting. The boy's job is simple enough. He delivers mail between departments, crossing paths with producers who don't look up from contracts, and slipping past assistants carrying revised scripts for films already scheduled around the urgency of wartime production. He sees actors pass through the same hallways he walks, but they exist in a different layer of the building entirely. Fox, at this moment, is operating like a wartime factory for images. Hollywood is releasing wave after wave of films built to reinforce morale, shape public perception, and translate global conflict into structured storytelling. Casting departments are under constant pressure to find faces that look authentic in uniform, men who don't need to be taught how to stand like soldiers. Well, as fate would have it, this young boy happens to be such a person. He doesn't realize it himself, of course, but someone in casting sees him as a possibility. He is asked to stand still, then to turn slightly under studio light. There is no grand speech, no declaration of discovery. A short time later, he is standing on a soundstage. This teenager was Richard Jaeckel, and the film, Guadalcanal Diary, was a Fox war film based on the real U.S. Marine campaign in the Pacific. The film itself was part of a broader cycle of early war cinema that included titles like Wake Island and Sahara, productions that relied heavily on young, relatively unknown actors who could convincingly represent enlisted men rather than established Hollywood personalities. What made Jaeckel's entry unusual was the speed and informality of it. Many actors of the era spent years in stage work or minor studio contracts before appearing on screen. Jaeckel moved from mailroom employee to credited film actor in the middle of an active global conflict. After Guadalcanal Diary, Jaeckel's trajectory aligned with the broader wartime shift in Hollywood casting. Studios began prioritizing realism over glamour, and his early exposure positioned him within a niche category: the believable enlisted man. This category would define his career for decades, but outside of the studio, another frontier awaited him: war, duty, and the soldier's face of Hollywood. After his initial screen work, Richard Jaeckel entered the U.S. Merchant Marine during the Second World War, a service branch responsible for transporting troops, fuel, and supplies across some of the most dangerous shipping routes on Earth. Merchant Marine casualty rates during the war were among the highest of any American service, with estimates often placing losses at roughly 1 in 26 mariners killed, far deadlier than many frontline combat roles. For Jaeckel, this meant trading controlled studio sets for Atlantic and Pacific convoys, where German U-boats and Japanese air attacks were a constant threat. That experience mattered in a way Hollywood immediately understood after the war ended in 1945. The studio system was shifting into a new phase, no longer just manufacturing wartime propaganda, but trying to process what the conflict had done to American identity. Veterans returned not only with service records, but with lived experiences that casting directors now treated as assets. Jaeckel's return to Los Angeles placed him in that exact intersection. Hollywood was heavily invested in what would later be called semi-documentary realism. Films began moving away from studio-polished fantasy toward location shooting, grainier textures, and performances that felt untrained but authentic. Directors like William Wellman and Louis Milestone were part of a broader shift that valued actors who could carry the physical memory of war into their roles. Jaeckel fit this transition almost too naturally. His face was not sculpted for leading man glamour in the classical sense. It was structured for endurance, fatigue, and credibility under pressure. That made him a reliable choice for military roles at a time when Hollywood was producing a steady stream of war films. He began accumulating roles that reinforced a specific screen identity. Enlisted men, junior officers, sailors, cowboys, and law enforcement figures who existed inside systems larger than themselves. Films like 12 O'Clock High and other contemporaneous war narratives were building a language of hierarchy, duty, and psychological strain. Jaeckel's casting fit into this ecosystem because he already embodied the kind of disciplined anonymity those stories required. Unlike actors who transitioned into studio-led stardom programs, Jaeckel's career developed laterally rather than vertically. He was not positioned as a headline romantic lead in the way contemporaries such as Gregory Peck or William Holden were being promoted. Instead, he became part of what industry insiders often called reliable casting stock, or performers who could be inserted into military or frontier narratives without needing narrative justification for their presence. This meant consistent work, but limited visibility in top billing. By the early 1950s, the effects of this trajectory became clearer. Hollywood's obsession with war was evolving. The Korean War reignited demand for military-themed films, and Jaeckel's service background gave him continued relevance. He was repeatedly cast in roles that required physical realism rather than stylized performance. At the same time, the structure of the studio system was beginning to loosen. The 1948 Paramount Decree had forced major studios to divest their theater chains, weakening the long-term contract system that had previously controlled actor careers. For someone like Jaeckel, this meant fewer guaranteed studio contracts, but more independent casting opportunities. He made the best of this situation, building a career in the shadows of legends. The post-war studio system still demanded a constant supply of films built around war memory and frontier mythology, and Jaeckel fit directly into both. He wasn't positioned as a headliner in publicity campaigns, but he was present in the kind of films that defined the decade's mainstream identity: military dramas, westerns, and moral conflict narratives anchored by larger-than-life stars. One of his earliest notable appearances in this era came in Sands of Iwo Jima, released just as the decade turned. The film starred John Wayne in one of his defining military roles as Sergeant Stryker, dramatizing the brutal Pacific Campaign during the Second World War. Jaeckel's presence in the film placed him inside a tightly controlled hierarchy of screen masculinity, Wayne at the center, surrounded by ensemble soldiers who represented the collective experience of combat. The film itself was a major commercial success and earned Wayne an Academy Award nomination. As the 1950s progressed, he became increasingly associated with Western and frontier narratives. The genre dominated American cinema during the Cold War years. In The Gunfighter, starring Gregory Peck, the story focused on aging violence and the psychological weight of reputation in a lawless world. Jaeckel's role in such films was not about narrative centrality, but about reinforcing the environment. Lawmen, deputies, soldiers, or men embedded in systems of authority. These roles required a specific kind of credibility rather than star power. and his casting reflected how studios categorized actors based on visual and behavioral consistency rather than celebrity trajectory. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, he appeared in Town Without Pity, a courtroom drama starring Kirk Douglas that dealt with themes of military justice and social stigma. The film itself was notable for its more modern tone. Alongside his film work, he maintained a strong presence in television, which became increasingly important during the 1950s as the medium exploded across American households. By the end of the decade, television ownership in the United States had risen dramatically, reshaping how actors sustained long-term careers. For someone like Jaeckel, television provided additional steady work, often in anthology series and episodic dramas that mirrored the same themes found in his filmography: war, law, survival, and institutional conflict. Industry perception of actors like him was shaped by necessity. War films required believable military units, westerns required populated frontier towns, and courtroom dramas required institutional depth. Jaeckel became one of the actors Hollywood repeatedly turned to when it needed authenticity without distraction. He was not written into stories to be remembered individually, but to make the world around the lead characters feel inhabited and real. By the end of the 1960s, his filmography had quietly expanded into dozens of credits, many of them uncelebrated outside industry circles, but consistently present across major studio output. He had worked through one of the most transformative periods in Hollywood history, from the final years of the classical studio system to the rise of modern, director-driven cinema. Yet through all of it, his position remained remarkably stable, always inside the frame, often close to the action, but almost never at its center. That paradox defined his legacy in this period. In an industry built on stardom, Richard Jaeckel built something different: longevity without spotlight, recognition without headline status, a career that survived not by ascending above Hollywood's hierarchy, but by remaining essential within its shadows. Peak recognition and the Oscar moment. By 1971, Richard Jaeckel had already spent nearly 3 decades inside Hollywood's machinery, moving through war films, westerns, and television dramas. He was not an actor audiences went to see specifically, but he was someone they almost always saw once the screen filled with soldiers, workers, or men embedded in systems larger than themselves. That pattern changed, at least briefly, when he appeared in Sometimes a Great Notion, a film that pulled him closer to the center of industry recognition than anything before it. Directed by Paul Newman, who also starred in the film alongside Henry Fonda, Sometimes a Great Notion was an adaptation of Ken Kesey's 1964 novel. The story followed a logging family in Oregon, locked in a bitter labor conflict, blending physical struggle with psychological tension and generational defiance. It was a production shaped by the early 1970s shift in Hollywood toward more character-driven, morally complex storytelling, where ensemble casts carried emotional weight rather than single heroic leads. Jaeckel's role placed him inside that tightly constructed environment, not as decoration, but as part of the narrative pressure. When the film was released in 1971, it arrived during a transitional moment in American cinema. The old studio system had fully dissolved, and the new Hollywood era was emerging, defined by directors like Robert Altman, Sidney Lumet, and Francis Ford Coppola. These films often emphasized realism, moral ambiguity, and ensemble performance over traditional star hierarchy. In that environment, supporting actors had more room to be noticed, but also more competition for visibility within dense casts. Jaeckel's performance stood out precisely because it came from someone who had spent decades mastering restraint and functional realism rather than theatrical display. The Academy Awards ceremony held in 1972 recognized this performance with a nomination for Best Supporting Actor. That category in that year included some of the most intense competition of the era. Jaeckel was nominated alongside actors working in similarly complex, character-heavy films, and while he did not win, the nomination itself placed him formally inside the industry's highest tier of acknowledgement. The timing was also rather fateful. By 1972, Jaeckel was in his mid-40s, already associated with more than 100 screen credits across film and television. Unlike actors whose careers are defined by early breakthroughs followed by decline, his trajectory moved in the opposite direction: accumulation without elevation, followed by delayed recognition. The Oscar nomination briefly disrupted that pattern. However, the industry response did not translate into a structural shift in his career. Hollywood was increasingly driven by bankable leads, emerging youth stars, and auteur-driven casting decisions that often centered on specific directorial visions rather than studio-managed star systems. While sometimes a great notion gave him visibility, it did not reposition him within casting hierarchies that determined leading man status. He was not rebranded or repositioned for major headline roles. Instead, he continued to occupy the same professional space he had held for years. There is also a practical industry reality behind this limitation. Supporting actors, even Oscar-nominated ones, rarely transition into top-billed roles without a corresponding studio marketing push or a breakout box office vehicle designed around them. Jaeckel's career did not receive that kind of structural investment. Late career stability and gradual industry fade. One of his most recognizable later career touchpoints remained The Dirty Dozen, Robert Aldrich's ensemble war film starring Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, and Jim Brown. Although the film technically predates his Oscar nomination era, its continued cultural relevance into the 1970s kept actors like Jaeckel associated with its legacy. The movie itself was a major box office success for MGM, built around a premise of military misfits sent on a rather daring mission during the Second World War. Jaeckel's role placed him inside a large ensemble where individual performances were intentionally designed to blend into the larger group dynamic rather than dominate it. That structure would increasingly define the kind of work he was offered in the years that followed. As the decade progressed, Hollywood itself was undergoing one of its most dramatic transformations since the end of the studio system. The rise of New Hollywood shifted emphasis toward younger directors and psychologically complex narratives, often centered on anti-heroes rather than traditional institutional figures. Films like Taxi Driver, The Godfather, and Apocalypse Now reflected this change. In this evolving landscape, actors like Jaeckel, who had built careers on procedural realism and institutional roles, found fewer opportunities. Television, however, remained a consistent outlet. By the 1970s, the medium had become the dominant entertainment platform in American households, with weekly episodic series replacing the old reliance on studio film contracts for steady employment. Jaeckel appeared across a wide range of TV dramas and anthology series, often in guest-starring roles that mirrored his film identity. Military personnel, law enforcement figures, and working-class men embedded in conflict-driven narratives. This period of his career was defined less by headline projects and more by continuous participation in the infrastructure of American screen storytelling. Despite steady work, the nature of recognition changed significantly. In earlier decades, even supporting actors in major studio films could achieve strong public identification due to studio publicity systems and repeated theatrical re-releases. As the decades progressed, however, the fragmentation of media consumption meant that visibility was more dependent on leading roles. The film industry's structural changes also played a role. The decline of mid-budget ensemble war and Western films, genres that had once been central to his career, reduced the demand for actors specializing in those archetypes. At the same time, casting trends began favoring either younger emerging leads or highly specific character actors tied to individual directors or franchises. Jaeckel, whose career had been built on adaptability within a studio-driven system, now existed in a more fragmented marketplace where long-term character consistency was less commercially central. Even so, he never left the screen. His late career filmography continued to expand with smaller roles across both film and television, maintaining a level of professional consistency that many actors struggled to achieve in the increasingly volatile entertainment economy of the 1980s. But consistency in employment did not necessarily translate into financial security or public visibility, especially in an era where residual structures and actor compensation were still evolving. And thus began the downward spiral, financial collapse, and the loss of stability. By the time the early 1990s arrived, Richard Jaeckel's career no longer looked like the steady, almost industrial stream of work that had defined his earlier decades. The roles were still coming, but the financial architecture behind them, residuals, savings, stability, and consistent high-paying studio contracts, was far less secure than what had existed during the classical studio system era he had entered in the 1940s. Hollywood itself had changed its payment structures multiple times, and many long-working character actors found themselves exposed to irregular income patterns that did not match the length of their careers. By 1994, that slow erosion of stability reached a breaking point. Jaeckel filed for bankruptcy in the United States, with reported debts of approximately $1.7 million. The filing placed him among several older Hollywood professionals who faced financial collapse after decades of steady but non-headline employment. Unlike major stars, whose income streams were reinforced by residual-heavy contracts or ongoing royalties from leading roles, supporting actors from earlier studio eras often depended heavily on continuous work rather than long-term back-end earnings. When that work slowed or shifted in scale, financial pressure accumulated quietly rather than suddenly. The most visible consequence of the bankruptcy was the loss of his Brentwood home in Los Angeles, a neighborhood associated with long-established entertainment industry residents. Brentwood, particularly in the late 20th century, was known for housing actors, executives, and creatives who had transitioned from active studio careers into retirement or semi-retirement stability. Losing a home in that area signaled more than a financial setback. It marked a structural displacement from the physical geography of Hollywood success itself. Along with the property, much of his accumulated personal belongings were lost or liquidated as part of the financial restructuring. Unlike some Hollywood bankruptcy cases that involve litigation over mismanagement or legal disputes, his situation is generally understood as the result of long-term financial strain, reduced earning consistency in later years, and the broader economic shifts affecting actors from his generation. This was a period when the industry was transitioning into franchise-driven blockbusters and increasingly globalized distribution models. Major financial rewards were concentrating around a smaller group of leading actors and intellectual properties, while mid-tier and supporting actors often faced reduced screen time and fewer high-paying roles. Following the bankruptcy, Jaeckel's living situation changed significantly. He became associated with the motion picture and television country house and hospital in Woodland Hills, California, a facility operated by the Motion Picture and Television Fund. This institution has long served as a safety net for industry professionals who require medical care or assisted living support later in life. His residence there reflected the reality that, despite a long and consistent career, financial independence in retirement was no longer sustainable. But his troubles were about to get worse. Illness, family decline, and compounding personal hardship. After decades of appearing in war films, westerns, and television dramas, the physical demands of aging, combined with a long medical arc that had not yet fully revealed itself, began to reshape his day-to-day reality in ways that were no longer cinematic, but clinical. At the center of his personal struggle was a diagnosis of malignant melanoma, a form of skin cancer known for its aggressive progression if not detected early. Melanoma is often associated with cumulative ultraviolet exposure, and in Jaeckel's case, modern biographies frequently note his outdoor lifestyle during earlier decades, including recreational surfing as part of the broader risk context. By the 1990s, however, the disease had progressed to a stage that required sustained medical attention rather than intermittent treatment. The condition marked a decisive shift from active working actor to patient under long-term care supervision. This medical trajectory eventually placed him within the motion picture and television country house and hospital in Woodland Hills, California, a facility operated by the Motion Picture and Television Fund. The institution has historically functioned as a safety net for industry professionals who reach periods of medical or financial vulnerability, offering both residential care and medical services. For Jaeckel, residence there represented not an abrupt relocation, but the end point of a gradual transition away from independent living, as health demands began to exceed what private arrangements could realistically support. While his own health was declining, a parallel crisis was unfolding within his family life. His wife, Antoinette Marchus Jaeckel, whom he had married in 1947, developed Alzheimer's disease during the same general period. Alzheimer's is a progressive neurodegenerative condition that affects memory, cognition, and daily functioning over time, often placing emotional and logistical strain on families over extended years rather than sudden episodes. Richard Jaeckel and Antoinette Helene Marchus had been married since May 29, 1947, when the future actor was only 20 years old and still at the very beginning of the career that would eventually span more than 5 decades. The couple married in Tijuana, Mexico, long before the Oscar nomination, long before The Dirty Dozen, and long before Hollywood would come to recognize him as one of its most dependable character actors. Together, they built a family and raised 2 sons, Barry and Richard Jr., while Jaeckel spent decades moving from one production to the next across film and television. Their marriage ultimately lasted nearly half a century, surviving the rise and fall of studios, changing Hollywood trends, financial pressures, and the unpredictable demands of an acting career. As Antoinette developed Alzheimer's disease, the illness carried a particularly cruel dimension. The memories that formed the foundation of nearly 50 years together, the early struggles, the family milestones, the career victories, and the countless ordinary moments in between, were increasingly vulnerable to a disease that erodes the ability to access them. While his wife faced cognitive decline, Jaeckel was dealing with malignant melanoma, a serious skin cancer that steadily weakened his physical condition. The overlap created an unusually difficult reality. Rather than one spouse serving as the long-term caretaker for the other, both were confronting forms of dependency at the same time. One battle was physical, the other neurological. One threatened the body, the other threatened memory. As financial pressures mounted, health declined, and the couple's independence diminished, the life they had built since 1947 was increasingly replaced by hospitals, treatment schedules, and assisted care. For a man whose career had been built on portraying soldiers, lawmen, and survivors, the final challenge was one he could not fight through determination alone. Watching both his own health and the stability of a nearly 50-year marriage eroded by forces beyond his control. Within the broader context of the 1990s entertainment industry, Jaeckel's situation also reflects a recurring pattern among long-serving character actors of his generation. Final years, industry care, and quiet end. Jaeckel's final residence was within the Motion Picture and Television Country House and Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, which was established in 1921 and had long functioned as a safety net for actors, technicians, and behind-the-scenes workers who required medical care or assisted living in later life. By the 1990s, it had become especially important for older performers from the studio era whose careers had spanned decades but whose retirement resources did not always match modern financial expectations. Jaeckel's presence there was not an isolated case, but part of a broader generational pattern. Many actors who had worked extensively in mid-century Hollywood eventually transitioned into this type of institutional care, particularly those whose careers were defined by volume of work rather than headline salaries or residual-heavy contracts. Actors like Larry Pennell, who worked steadily in television and film across decades, also ended up relying on industry support systems later in life. Likewise, performers such as Ralph Meeker and William Schallert, though differing in timing and circumstances, reflect the same broader reality of character actors whose careers were extensive but not structured around long-term financial ownership of their work. Even within the same institutional ecosystem, Many non-actor professionals, including camera crew members and production staff from the 1940s to 60s studio era, followed similar trajectories. Jaeckel, with more than 150 film and television credits accumulated over roughly 50 years, represented exactly that archetype. Constant employment without the long-term financial insulation that later generations of actors might achieve through syndication royalties or franchise ownership. Despite the constraints of his health and financial situation, he remained connected to the Hollywood community through the very system that housed him. The Motion Picture and Television Fund was not only a medical facility, but also a social environment where retired industry professionals maintained contact with peers who had shared similar career trajectories. This continuity of community meant that, even in his final years, Jaeckel was still within the orbit of the industry he had entered as a teenager in the early 1940s. On June 14, 1997, Richard Jaeckel died at the age of 70 in Woodland Hills, California. His death marked the end of a career that had begun more than half a century earlier. What distinguishes the end of his life within Hollywood history is not scandal or public controversy, but the absence of both. There were no major legal disputes surrounding his legacy, no widely documented public conflicts, and no sensationalized downfall narrative. Financially, he did not leave behind a widely reported estate or major fortune. Antoinette Helen Marchus Jaeckel, his wife of nearly half a century, survived him. Their marriage, which began on May 29, 1947, in Tijuana, Mexico, had endured through every major phase of his career, from early post-war roles to his Oscar-nominated peak and eventual financial decline. After Richard's death, Antoinette remained outside the public eye. Their two sons, Barry Jaeckel and Richard Jaeckel Jr., also remained largely absent from Hollywood's public narrative. Barry pursued a professional career in golf, competing on the PGA Tour and establishing himself in a completely different professional sphere from his father's film career. His public visibility came primarily through sports reporting rather than entertainment media. Richard Jr., by contrast, maintained an even lower profile, with very limited publicly available biographical or professional information. Unlike many Hollywood families where second-generation members often enter the entertainment industry or engage with media retrospectives, the Jaeckel children did not become public figures within Hollywood discourse. There are no major documented interviews, published memoirs, or widely circulated family accounts detailing their experiences during their parents' illnesses. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.